Hi there, my name's Emily and I'm the crocheter and pattern designer behind Wavelengths. And I just wanted to talk to you guys a bit about tension and yarn weight, especially as we're getting more into that fall season and getting back into sweater weather making. Let's jump right into it. So we've got 4 yarn weights here, starting from size 3 or DK yarn, size 4 or Aran or worsted weight yarn, size 5, which is a chunky, and size 6, which is a super chunky. To figure out which yarn weight you've got going on, the best indicator are these numbers here, where you can see that size there. It says 6 super bulky, but depending on which yarn you're using, you won't always get that number. So a good indicator of knowing what the yarn weight is knowing which hook is associated with that yarn. So DK or size 3 yarns typically will go for a 4mm hook or needles if you're knitting. An Aran weight yarn will use a 5mm hook and or needles. Chunky will typically have a 6mm recommendation, and then the super bulkies can really depend, but this one has got a 9mm recommended hook for this Lion Brand Woolies. So I've put together a tension swatch using all 4 of these yarn weights, and for all of them I used an 8mm hook or an M hook to produce these. So you can see how as we get smaller, the square also gets smaller because the yarn is thinner. And as we go along the way, our square will get bigger because we're using thicker yarn. I'll be speaking mostly in relation to my patterns, just because this is how I can best explain it. So most of my patterns use a chunky size yarn, size 5, and this is the proper tension that you're looking to aim for, which is a 4x4 inch or 10cm by 10cm square. We've got that going on there, 10, 4, so we're good there. So most of my patterns are written using the mesh stitch, and to meet that gauge with the size 5 yarn, you're going to want to have 8 mesh stitch across and 13 rows up. So that'll give you an accurate or mostly accurate sizing when it comes to when you build out your sweaters. So now I've been asked a lot if we can use size 4 yarn for my patterns. The simple answer is yes, but this is where it gets a little bit complicated. So if you're using size 4 yarn with an 8mm hook, your tension is going to end up being maybe a little under 1/2 inch or maybe 1/4 inch smaller than the required gauge to be able to meet more accurate measurements of the finished garment. So with that being said, you can either go up a hook size or 2 to try and meet the gauge so that you can get some accurate sizing. The issue with that is that then your stitch work is gonna be a lot more gappy. There's gonna be a lot more spaces in between each of the stitches, and I am all for something that's a little bit more snug. I did a bit of an example of that to show you how it would look. I did it with the DK yarn just because that's what I had handy. So this is that DK swatch where I used the 8mm hook. Even with this one, it is still quite gappy, and it is a little bit more on the what I would call flimsy side, which if that's what you're looking for, go for it. That's totally fine. But I just wanted to show you the example of here I went up a hook size and I'm meeting the gauge now. So this is 4 inches across or 10 centimeters. I didn't do the full square, but you can see here that this is really quite got a lot of spaces between all of the stitches. So it's not an ideal situation. It's not something that you necessarily want to have happen, but if, again, this is completely up to your preference. If this is what you want it to, the yarn that you want to use and that the look that you're okay with using, then just adjust your hook size to be able to meet the gauge necessary to get the proper sizing. So if you're really keen to use a size 4 yarn to work on my patterns that have the size 5 requirement, you can absolutely go for it. Unfortunately, I can't guarantee what hook size that you should use for it, depending on how you want the spacing to end up. If you do want to meet the gauge with it, you'll have to play around with that as well. The other option is to use smaller hooks and create that sort of tighter knit and work a size or 2 up of the pattern, just so that you'll have something that fits a little bit better. But again, I can't guarantee what the sizing of that will end up looking like. Another option, if size 5 yarn is not readily available where you are, is with that size 4 yarn, you can double up on it and double strand it, and it'll equal size 5 yarn. So that's another option as well. So this gives you a really good idea of different yarn weights, using that same 8mm hook, and how the squares go from smaller to bigger. So you'll end up with a different size garment if you don't follow the recommended yarn weight in the pattern, which is fine, but just be conscious of that while you're considering your yarn choices. All right, so as a recap for all of this, things to keep in mind. So smaller yarn weight will equal a smaller product, and vice versa. If you're using a thicker yarn, you'll get a thicker product. Understand that attempting to meet the gauge with a smaller yarn weight will result in looser stitching, as we saw in this example. Consider working a size or 2 bigger when you're using smaller weight. But if you're doing that and trying to keep those stitches tight, unfortunately, I can't guarantee what kind of gauge or hook size to aim for when you're working with those tighter stitches. And thank you so much for tuning in. If you have any questions or comments on this, feel free to drop that down in the comment section below, or feel free to reach out to me on Instagram. You can find me there at _wavelengths. And hopefully this was helpful and informative.